Did you know that DC Comics was almost 100 years old? Yeah, in 1934, two comic book lovers, Jerry Siegel and Joe they met up with a guy called Malcolm Wheeler Nichols. Together, they would form Detective Comics, which would later become known as DC Comics. Their first issue was a huge success. It sold over 2 million copies, and it featured the first ever appearance of Batman. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. See, the Great Depression was in full swing when they started the company. So in order to keep the doors open, they had to publish comics with very low budgets. This meant that for the first few years, Batman was not only a detective, he was also a superhero. They couldn't afford to have him fight villains like the Joker and Penguin, so instead, he would face off against criminals like DeFaze and the Catwoman. Now, despite the financial struggles, the company was on the right track. They had found their niche in the market. They were making money hand over fist. By the end of the decade, they would publish the first ever issue of Superman, and the rest, as they say, is history. Did you know that DC Comics was almost cancelled before it even began? See, back in 1938, Superman was set to make his debut in this comic. But when the executives at DC saw the final pages of the issue, they weren't too happy. You see, these were the original plans for the cover of Action Comics. No. One. But they ultimately decided that it was too busy and too confusing, so they asked the artist to simplify it. And well, we got this instead. But it wasn't just the cover that was simplified. The story itself went through several revisions before it was released. Originally, Superman was going to be a lot more powerful. He could fly, he had super strength, and he could shoot lasers out of his eyes. But they dialed it back a bit for his first appearance, so that he wouldn't be too overpowered. And I am glad they did, because if Superman was as strong as he is now from the start, I think it would have been a lot harder for him to grow as a character over the years. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Did you know that DC Comics was almost cancelled after only 3 issues? In 1939, the world was in crisis. World War II was raging and people were afraid to buy new, expensive things like comic books. But that didn't stop the three amigos from coming out with issue number 4 of Detective Comics, which introduced the world to Batman. People loved him so much that they actually bought the next issue, which featured a story about an alien named Kal-El, who crashes to Earth and is sent to live with his aunt and uncle in Smallville. These two iconic characters saved the company and allowed it to thrive for decades to come. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were bumps along the way, like when Batman was almost cancelled again in the 1950s, because people thought he was too violent. But we've got a whole video on that, including how the Justice League saved Batman from cancellation. So stay tuned to find out more. Did you know that DC Comics started out as a small independent comic book company? In the 1940s, they published their first superheroes, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, The Flash, and Aquaman. This era is known as the Golden Age of comics. It's when Superman was at his peak popularity and Batman was just getting started. In 1940, DC published the first issue of the Justice Society of America, the very first superhero team ever. The company's name would change from National Comics to DC Comics in 1946, and then in the 1950s, they introduced the world to some of their most iconic characters like the Joker, Harley Quinn, Penguin, Catwoman, and Robin. But it was in the 1960s that DC really became a powerhouse. They published the first issue of the Teen Titans, which introduced the world to a new generation of heroes. Stay tuned for more fun facts about DC Comics. 1956-1970 was the Silver Age. This is when DC really started to find its footing. They had their own publishing company. They were no longer beholden to the whims of the censors at the Comics Code Authority, and this gave them the freedom to really push the boundaries of what they could publish. The Flash was the first superhero to break the sound barrier. Green Lantern and the Justice League were introduced, and Superman had his powers officially recognized by the US government. But it wasn't just the superheroes getting more powerful. Villains like Brainiac and Darkseid became iconic, and for the first time ever, a comic book character died. In 1960, the villain Gorilla Grodd was killed off. But if you thought that was shocking, it gets better. In 1968, Batman and Robin were both killed by the Joker. And then in 1972, Wonder Woman's sidekick, Steve Trevor, was also killed. Things were getting dark. People, what? You want more? Okay. In 1973, DC published the first issue of their horror comics anthology series, showcasing stories of the macabre and the supernatural. Did you know that DC Comics was almost cancelled in the 1960s? See, in the early days of television, Batman was a huge hit. The campy 1960s Batman TV series starring Adam West became a cultural phenomenon. Kids would dress up as Batman and Robin and go door to door asking for money. And when they got enough, they'd buy a giant bag of groceries and deliver it to the nearest food bank. But then something strange happened. The show's producers decided to get rid of the one thing that made it popular. They wanted to make it darker, more like the comics. And to promote the new serious tone, they released a comic book tie-in to coincide with the show's 3rd season. But it wasn't the campy fun that people were used to. So sales were low, and the comic almost became a flop. Luckily, a last-minute change in the storyline saved the day. The writers realized that the reason why the comic wasn't selling was because it was too serious. So they added some campy elements to the story, which brought back the fans, and the comic became a hit once again. The 1980s were a time of modernization for DC Comics. This is when they updated the Flash's costume to make it more aerodynamic. They also modernized the look of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and they introduced new characters like Donna Troy, a new member of the Teen Titans, and the villain Cheshire Cat, who would go on to become one of the most popular members of the Legion of Doom. But it wasn't all fun and games. In 1986, DC Comics had a massive crossover event called Crisis on Infinite Earths. This event completely changed the DC universe as we know it, introducing new characters like Booster Gold and the Justice League International. It also led to the creation of iconic storylines like The Dark Knight Returns, which introduced the world to a new Joker and a new Batman villain. Bane, the late 80s and early 90s saw the rise of independent comics, which gave way to even more creativity and innovation in the industry. And with the introduction of new characters, John Stewart the Green Lantern and the revamp of other characters like Nightwing, DC Comics was able to stay fresh and relevant during a time when the comic book industry was changing rapidly. 2000s movie era begins. Christopher Nolan redefined Batman with his The Dark Knight trilogy, and then DC decided to expand our universe into animation with Justice League Unlimited and Teen Titans. 2010s. The Snyder Cut, Zack Snyder's take on Superman and Man of Steel, was both a critical and commercial success, and then he assembled a team of heroes for Justice League, which was released in 4 parts. 2017, The Flash. In an effort to compete with Marvel's cinematic universe, DC decided to lean into their strengths, starting with their most popular character, The Flash. 2020s. Peacemaker. After the success of The Suicide Squad, James Gunn was hired to write and direct Peacemaker, and the series became a fan favorite. 2023 Shazam. Fury of the Gods. The first Shazam movie was a hit with critics and audiences alike, so a sequel was announced shortly after its release. And that's where we are today. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.